If you're exploring Irish whiskey, you can't go past the oldest distillery of them all, Bushmills. And that's why today I've got the 10-year-old, the 16-year-old, and the 21-year-old. So let's check them out. Hey there, I'm Nath Martyn, the Whisky Scribe. Taste is subjective, whiskey is diverse, and this channel is all about understanding it well enough to enjoy it on your own terms. Now, with St. Patrick's Day coming up on the 17th of March, I always like to dedicate the entire month of March to exploring Irish whiskey. Because quite often, and for quite a few years, Scotch and bourbon have very much taken the highlight globally, whereas it's easy to forget that Irish whiskey actually started it all. Whiskey originated in Ireland. Arguably, depending on how far back through the actual production process you want to go. But anyway, so if we're exploring Irish whiskey, the oldest distillery, the oldest licensed distillery in the world that is still running is Bushmills. Now you'll notice that all of the bottles of Bushmills whiskey have got on the side, in the glass, it says 1608, even on the cork. So that 1608, that marks the year that Bushmills Distillery first released their license to distill whiskey. But it's believed that they were actually producing whiskey in that area for about hundreds of years before that anyway. So that's a long history of whiskey making. So if you've dabbled in Irish whiskies for a while, you may have noticed that the majority of Irish whiskies are often blends. And that's because in 1850 there was a tax imposed on malted barley. And so a lot of distillers moved away from using 100% malted barley so they could cut costs. They started using grain and oat and different sorts of things to be able to make up the mash bill so it's not an overall expensive process. Now, although Bushmills still does have a couple of blended whiskies in their range, the majority of what they make is still single malt, and that's because they did not want to move away from quality. They wanted to focus on making single malt whiskey. In an Irish way, it's still triple distilled, but the focus was on flavor and quality rather than trying to cut costs. While Bushmills does have a couple of blended whiskies in their range, what I've got here are the first three age statement single malts in their core range. So we've got the 10-year-old, the 16, and the 21-year-old. And these are all actually a little bit different. They're not just different ages, they've all got slightly different combinations of barrels being used to make them, so they're all unique in their own way other than just the age. So if we start with the Bushmills 10-year-old, it's single malt, triple distilled in traditional copper pot stills, aged in a combination of ex-bourbon and sherry casks. Keep note that for this whiskey they just say sherry casks, they don't designate a type. It is chill filtered and does have colour added, bottled at 40% or 80 proof, and it retails in Australia for around $75. Now I know that I said that this one does have colour added. When you look at it, this is quite a light coloured whiskey. Oh, Jesus, I forgot how oily this one is. Oh, single malt indeed. Hoping you can see that. You all know I love my legs. Considering there is actually colour added in this, but they say it's added for consistency, I do actually believe that's the reason for adding colour to these ones. This is quite a light colour for a 10-year-old whiskey. You know, if you were adding colour to try and make it look darker and give the impression of a lot more cask influence, you'd be adding quite a bit more colour than that. So the colour being added for consistency, I'd say, yeah, I'd probably agree with that because they haven't added too much. But on the nose, there's quite a bit of like this fresh, zesty sort of lemon going on in there. It's a very light whiskey. You've got notes of honey happening. This is actually, although I've never done just a straight review on Bushmills 10-year-old on this channel before, the second YouTube video I ever posted was a 5 affordable whiskies, and Bushmills was the Irish option in that because it is a great priced whiskey for something that you can still drink neat. So on that note, so I think my tasting notes on this time is going to be the same as the video I did 3 years ago. There's this wonderful, you've still got that little bit of honey and that little bit of lemon happening on the palate, but the addition that you've got that wasn't there on the nose for me is this little bit of milk chocolate going on. And it's actually like that oily little texture in your mouth that you get when you've had milk chocolate. Like if you've had like a block of Cadbury's, that coating in your mouth, it's like that. It's like that milk chocolate. Yes, it is very drinkable neat, especially for the price point that you can get it here in Australia. That chocolatey note in the mouth, that does linger for a little bit. Like, that's why this is such a great priced whiskey to be drunk neat, because often, like if you're looking at whiskeys that are perfectly enjoyable neat, but they're sort of below that $80 mark here, often like where you're actually lacking a little bit is a little bit of texture and mouthfeel and a little bit of the length of the finish. This still has an oily, nice texture mouthfeel, and that lingers on the palate. So that chocolatey note that coats your mouth, that sticks around for a while, for longer than you would expect for the price of this whiskey. So that's why I still recommend this as a bang for buck whiskey. In terms of what the distillery's tasting notes are, they say the appearance is amber gold, yes. On the nose, zesty citrus fruits entwined with a distinctive Bushmills honey character, followed by sweet aromas of fresh vanilla and milk chocolate. I didn't so much get the milk chocolate on the nose. There is a little bit of an oiliness there, so maybe somebody with a slightly better nose than me would have that carry across. On the palate, mellow sweet notes of vanilla, milk chocolate, yeah, and fresh honeysuckle married with delicate traces of toasted oak. I have to admit, I don't get a lot of the toasted oak on the palate, but they then say that the finish is just crisp and clean. And I feel like that actually does this a little bit of disservice, because that oily chocolatey note does stick around in the mouth for a while. It is crisp and clean, but I would call it a medium finish, a medium chocolatey finish. So yeah, in that case, they've kind of undersold themselves on that finish note. Lovely. Now, because I'm tasting 3 whiskies all in the same range, I'm going to put this aside precariously on the edge of the bench so that I can move on to the 16-year-old. So the Bushmills 16-year-old, again, it's a single malt whiskey, triple distilled in traditional copper pot stills, aged 16 years in ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry casks. So with this one, they actually state Oloroso sherry casks, with a finish of several months in port pipes. It is chill filtered and has color added, bottled at 40%, retails here for around $170. I've seen that price range go up and down quite a bit. So it averages around about $170, but I've also seen it as low as $130. So this is one of those ones where if you're gonna get it as a special occasion or as a gift or something like that, do some shopping around for a while beforehand, because you probably will manage to pick it up for almost $50 cheaper than what it normally goes for. Now, because this is a higher age statement whiskey, I'm going to use the 1920s blender's glass for this. I probably wouldn't normally bother with this one for a 16-year-old whiskey, but because the Bushmills at 40% ABV is kind of light, I do actually feel like I'm going to need sort of like a glass that's going to hone that nose and palate a little bit more, just for me to sort of get some of the complexity that's going on in there. Okay, so the first thing we notice on this one, it has a much deeper, darker color. Again, with color added, you've got to kind of take that with a little bit of a grain of salt, but like I said, with the 10-year-old, I do think they add their color just for batch consistency, because the 10, 16, and 21 are always available. So I'll try to give them the benefit of the doubt that it would have been something close to this color anyway, and they just add the color to make sure it always looks the same as the last year's batch. But again, look at how thick those legs are. That using single malt, even though it's triple distilled, it just allows the whiskey to carry a lot more flavor across. So on the nose on this one, this is definitely the better glass for this. So I presented these at our monthly whiskey tasting last night, and we were drinking out of Copitas, you know, basically about the same shape and size as a Glencairn glass. I'm getting a lot more on the nose using the 1920s blender's glass than I was last night. So yeah, I'm getting a little bit more of like this old damp wood going on. There's some much more intense sort of sweetness. Kind of like, I don't have a lot of those like, you know, English style desserts and things like that, but if you think of, I can't remember what it's called, there's a type of Christmas pudding where you have like this caramelized sort of sauce that pours over it. That's the sweet smell that I'm getting on the nose on this one. It's like this sort of pudding sauce that you would drizzle over a cake. I'm actually excited to see how this comes across on the palate now. There's like this honey dried fruit note going on in there, which is really, really nice. It's like, it's a caramelized like sweetness, but it's not caramel in the sense of caramelized sugar. It's like caramelized dark fruits, which is really, really nice. The oiliness carries like a little bit of like a, maybe a bit like an almond sort of nuttiness going on. Yeah. And it's that sweet old world wood sort of thing coming through there as well. I will say on this one, the finish is actually kind of a little bit short compared to the 10-year-old. The 10-year-old lingered a little bit longer than this one. The flavors in here that are on your palate are absolutely beautiful. So it would actually be really, really nice to see this one at a slightly higher ABV. I think if this was 46, maybe even 48%, I feel like that finish would last a lot longer, because the flavors that are there in the middle on the palate are just absolutely beautiful and significantly different to the 10-year-old. The 10-year-old is like, it's got that chocolatey note, but it's very also light and fresh at the same time. It's got that zesty orange note coming across, whereas this is all nuts and caramel and dark fruits, and yeah, it's a very, it feels weird to say full-bodied because the flavors are full-bodied even though the texture might be a little bit light. So the distillery's tasting notes for the 16-year-old was dark ruby red on the appearance. Yep. Nose, big and robust, treacle toffee and sweet spice. Maybe that's that sweet sauce note that I couldn't put my finger on. The palate is concentrated, full-bodied caramelized fruits and toasted nuts. That's pretty spot on. And the finish, deep jammed berries and milk chocolate. I didn't actually get the milk chocolate or much of the berries on the finish. Like I said, to me it sort of came across a little bit short, but that's not to detract at all from the palate itself, because that was absolutely beautiful. And like I said, slightly higher ABV would probably actually make that finish last a little bit longer. So then I've had this one in the 1920s blender's glass. I have to try the 21-year-old in the same glass. Put this one up here. Try not to let that fall down. So lastly, this is probably the oldest Irish whiskey I've ever had, 21-year-old Bushmills single malt. It's 21 years old, single malt whiskey, triple distilled in traditional copper pot stills, aged at least 19 years in ex-bourbon and Oloroso sherry butts, with a finish of 2 full years in Madeira casks, which is a Portuguese fortified wine. It is chill filtered and has color added, bottled at 40%, and it retails here for around $350. So this is a special occasion whiskey. This is something that you get somebody because they've just turned 21 or something like that. Again, it's an older whiskey. I'm going to use a blender's glass because I just want to get as much out of it as possible. I mean, at this stage, we're at 21 years. I wouldn't expect it to be any less, but still, those legs. I'm actually really impressed at the thickness of those legs, given that it's a 40% ABV whiskey. This has been watered down a fair bit. Those legs are still so thick. Like, seriously, could you imagine this thing at cask strength? Anyway, it's Very similar in depth of color to the 16-year-old. The only thing it's actually missing from that is that red hue, because this is a Madeira fortified wine, whereas the other one was port, which is also a fortified. Why are you less red? I don't know. I think some of the fortified wines get like more brown over time, so maybe the Madeira casks that he used for this are actually a slightly older fortified wine. I don't know enough about the fortified wines to be able to judge on that, so we'll just say that this is sort of like a gold to brown sort of dark color on the nose. That's really interesting. As I said, when I tried this last night, it was with a different glass. I was also leading a tasting, so I wasn't getting a chance to concentrate as much on the whiskey as I would have liked. But the difference between this and the 16-year-old is actually quite profound, because the 16-year-old has had a short finish in port casks. This has had a 2-year finish in fortified wine casks. And on the nose, at least, it's considerably less sweet. So I'm getting some honey and fruit sort of notes on there, but it's very dry, like very dry fruit. And almost like the nuttiness is, again, sort of like a little bit like, I don't know what sort of nut, I don't know what sort of nut to pick, but it's not a particularly oily nut. It is like a dry sort of nuttiness coming across in there. There was milk chocolate on the palate of the 10-year-old, whereas here it's not milk chocolate that I'm getting. It's more like it's bordering on cocoa powder, because it is so much drier than the other two whiskies. So that has me perplexed. I've got to go in and have a try. Slange. It's not incredibly different between the palate and the nose, but the nose was definitely a lot drier, you know, like with hints of fruit. On the palate, definite vanilla, but like the sort of vanilla that you would actually have in a cake. That immediately comes across. The cocoa, it's morphed into like a little bit more of a chocolate note now. But it's still not, the vanilla's there, the vanilla's sweet, but the chocolate note isn't sweet, if that makes sense. So like the sweetness is carrying across with the vanilla, but not carrying across with that cocoa note. For me, the nuttiness isn't quite as there on the palate as it was on the nose. But there's a bit of a symphony of flavors happening in there. And I'm really glad I tried this one in the blender's glass. I think, I always say, if you've got to appreciate a whiskey for what it is, for how it's made. And when you're a Scotch drinker, you're used to drinking single malts. Sometimes Irish whiskey comes across so delicate that you miss flavors, and it almost makes it seem like Irish whiskey doesn't have as much going on there. And which is why I like to give a full month to trying Irish whiskey, because you get used to it, and then you actually start to pick out the flavors that are actually hidden, because you're used to Scottish whiskey, the flavors being a little bit more upfront and a little bit more obvious. Whereas here in the Irish whiskey, it's sort of, it's subtle, it's nice, it's delicate, and you kind of almost have to go looking for it. But when you do find it, it's a wonderful array going on in there, because there's all these flavor notes. The sweetness is quite unique. The sweetness is only attached to certain notes and not others. This is actually quite a complex whiskey if you give it the time to properly pay attention to it. I'm genuinely impressed, because, yeah, like I said, last night when I was just sort of tasting them on the fly with perhaps not as specialized a glass, I was feeling like they may have been lacking a little bit, whereas now, giving it the time to properly, give it the attention it deserves, there's a lot more going on. I would still love to see this one at a higher ABV, but I don't think they've necessarily ruined it by bringing it down to 40%, because that oiliness still carries so much flavor across. The finish, again, I would call it a medium finish. Again, the ABV could probably actually extend that into a long finish. But that is really quite nice. In terms of what the distillery says about the tasting notes, appearance, deep mahogany. I wouldn't go quite that far. It is a darker brown sort of color. When I hear mahogany, I actually think about Dalmore and how much they used to add color to their whiskey. That's the mahogany level, the benchmark that I have when a whiskey is called mahogany color. But the nose, rich aromas of fresh honey and ripe summer fruits combined with delicate notes of sweet hazelnuts and cacao. So I'd agree with hazelnuts and cacao. Ripe summer fruits, yes. I don't know about honey because, like I said, I wasn't getting a lot of sweetness on the nose. Maybe like if somebody open a jar of honey but they're like 50 meters away and you're just getting a whiff of it. The palate, deep, rich flavors of dark chocolate and toffee precede notes of vanilla sweetness, toasted nuts, and just a hint of charred oak. I would say yes to the dark chocolate, yes to the toffee, yes to the vanilla sweetness. Not so much the toasted nuts and the charred oak for me. But yeah, those other flavor notes are there. And the finish is meant to be long and delicate. I would say medium and delicate. That's a beautiful whiskey, but if I bring it back, let's see. So all three of these are really enjoyable whiskies and they all have their place, I would say. And like I said, if you're a Scotch drinker, you've really got to reset your palate, get yourself into gear to be drinking Irish whiskey because it's just different. But in terms of these whiskies, who would they be for? The 10-year-old is just a great on-the-shelf whiskey. It's affordable, it's easy drinking, it's really, really nice. There's enough flavor notes in there for you to unpack if you actually just want to sit down and pay attention to the whiskey. But it's also simple enough that you can just enjoy it if you're having a couple of drams and having a chat with someone. So that's easily for anyone. Anyone who likes whiskey will probably find something to appreciate in that, unless you just have to have peat in your whiskey. Then the 16-year-old just had so much really unique sweetness going on in there. I think this would fit the sherry bomb, somebody who loves a sherry bomb and maybe wants something a little bit more unique or something different to Scotch, because it's a very different flavor palette, but it fits that sweet profile. The 21 is something really, really to unpack. It's, like I said, it'd be much, much better if we could have that one at a higher ABV, but there's still like a wide array of flavors going on there and they're quite balanced. Like there's complexity going on in how they're interacting with each other. I'm glad I was able to have all these on side by side because it's great to see how it progresses. And I also really appreciate how the distillery has done different barreling for different ages as well. You know, the 16-year-old isn't just this whiskey 6 years older and then the 21-year-old being this whiskey, but 11 years older. They're all different whiskeys. They're all whiskeys in their own right, which is great. But with St. Patrick's Day coming up, is something from the Bushmills range going to be something that you'll have a sip of on St. Patrick's Day? Or are you going to go for something else? Is there an Irish whiskey you always lean towards? Are you the redbreast enthusiast? Or is there something new that I haven't discovered yet? Because there's a lot more Irish distilleries popping up, which is why I'm going to continue exploring with Irish whiskies throughout this month and paying a little bit more attention to the history of Irish whiskey because it goes back a long way. But whatever it is that you're drinking, I don't know which one I'm going to finish on. I think the 21. Whatever it is you have on St. Patrick's Day, enjoy what's in your glass and slange. I'm getting more flavors now that I wasn't before. Brilliant.